Now on to someone who has no trouble with words. He is a New York Times best-selling author and host of Fox and Friends, Brian Kilmeade. Brian, thank you so much for your time here on the U.S. Report. Now, the Biden administration are manipulating words and telling Americans that there is no recession. We are in a transition. Here's Karine Jean-Pierre.
What we're seeing is that we are in a transition.
Brian, what on earth does transition mean, and what do these numbers mean for Americans?
I mean, there's a lot of things very different about the President Biden's administration. Number one, we're not really sure what the definition of a man and a woman is. That's kind of new. We're not really sure. Afghanistan, he said, was a great success. That's kind of new. I thought it was the biggest disaster in American military history, not worthy of what your men and women and our men and women have been fighting for the last 20 years. And then the president says, this is not a recession, when we know traditionally it's back-to-back quarters of negative growth. They tried to tell us 3 days ahead of time all the facts that we knew about the recession for the last, 80 years was wrong, because they almost anticipated this number coming out. They pointed to the unemployment being 3.4%, which is great. But the bigger problem in America is 11 million open jobs. For some reason, I don't know if you're having that in Australia, ever since the pandemic ended, a lot of people decide not to go back to work. They got too much free money in many cases, and our labor participation rate is so low. So he pointed out positive things in the economy rather than looking at normal barometers. But I'd say this. The average person watching us in Australia that has the Sky feed on their cable system says, how much does it cost when I go grocery shopping? Is it double? Yes. When I go out to eat, is it more than 2/3 than it was a year ago? Absolutely. When I go for gas, is it 60% higher than it was a year ago? Excuse me, it is 80%. So all these things are happening, and if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you don't really care about this Washington debate or how the president redefines it. They say life was a lot better 18 months ago. We got a vaccine. We're not at war. What's the problem?
Well, that's right. I mean, it is the same problem here in Australia. We do have low unemployment, but every employer I know is screaming out for people to come and take more jobs. But let's move on to Taiwan. Increasing chatter about a trip by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, potentially, which has angered Beijing, with Xi Jinping saying those who play with fire would get burned. Now, first of all, Brian, when did a foreign country get to dictate when a political leader, let alone the Speaker of the House of the United States, can and cannot go?
Number one, I love your show. I mean, I also have a radio show right after the Fox and Friends, and this is what most of the calls were about. Excuse me, you're telling me not to go to Taiwan? Why? They're an ally. I know about the one China policy. We got it. The Speaker of the House, who really does bold things that aren't good for their party, she actually did something that's good for the country, that took on China directly, and we appreciate that. She's got to go. And now our Pentagon, that we give billions of dollars to be the #1 military in the world, that's supposed to reassure nations like yours, like India, like South Korea, like Japan, that we got your back in the South China Sea, is saying, ooh, I don't think this is a good time. So she, to her credit, reached back and said, I'm going to get Michael McCall, the ranking member on the Republican side. I'm going to get a few others. We're going to go together. We're going to get a Republican, I'm sure, to stand up and go with her. She's got to do this trip. Now, if she never took the trip and had talked about the trip, that's one thing. But now that she said it, if she pulls back, our whole nation looks weak. And even though people say that's a mature thing to do, not in the world we're living with China, Iran, and Russia. They look at it as one word, and you understand this better than most. Weakness. We have to show Australia we're there for you. You've always shown you were there for us. We have to show those other nations in the region we are not afraid of China, and we understand the threat. If we back out now, next thing you know, these people are going to have to do ransom deals in order to guard their own security. And Taiwan has got to get the defensive weapons necessary to defend themselves from an invasion that's more than likely going to happen within the next 2 years. She has to go.
But isn't Biden looking really weak on this? Because I saw a couple of hours ago, the White House refused to back in her trip or say we can't tell her to go or can tell her to go. Joe Biden is looking very weak by not saying, no, I think this trip is a great idea, don't you think?
Yeah, and right before he announced he had COVID, he probably had it before, he said he got that question after a major speech in Massachusetts, and he said, yeah, the Pentagon doesn't think it's a really good idea for her to go. Excuse me? The Pentagon should be the tough guy in the schoolyard, the ones we have to say, calm down, let the diplomats take over. Instead, the Pentagon has gone woke and said, hey, let's not ruffle their feathers. The heck with ruffling China's feathers. They just did a major report on how many interceptions that they've had in the sea and in the air. China has been belligerent in both circumstances, and they have a number of cases where the U.S. has backed off or taken them on or pushed them back. Knowing their belligerence, the only thing you could do is stand up stronger, stand up more deliberately, show more resolve. Instead, from the White House and the Pentagon, we have, hey, Nancy, back off. The 82-year-old Speaker of the House is showing more tenacity than both other branches of government. And I tell you the truth, I'm not the biggest Nancy Pelosi fan. She's done a lot of unsavory things. I think her leadership is terrible. She's very overrated. But in this case, I 100% back her up.
Brian, I think we all agree with you. The only thing I've liked Nancy Pelosi before on is her investment advice. But that's all the time we've got here for you tonight, Brian. We love watching you on Fox and Friends. Hope you can join us again.